National parks are meant to be safe, but after years as a park ranger, I learned that safety is only an illusion once the sun goes down. Before we begin, support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. It helps keep these stories alive. And if you've ever heard something you couldn't explain in the woods, leave a comment below. This is one story I was never supposed to share. The night the forest echoed with a sound no living creature makes, I remember thinking it would be just another quiet shift. One more slow patrol in a place I had spent half my life learning to respect but never quite understanding. Fear doesn't announce itself in these woods. It grows slowly, like the way the fog thickens from a distant blur into something that touches your skin. And even though I'd been a ranger for over 17 years, working these mountains, these ravines, these endless miles of dense pine and unforgiving stone, I'd never felt what I felt that night. Not before and not since. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38 years old, and I work in the Northern District of Elkwood National Forest. If you're not from around here, you've probably never heard of it. It's the kind of place people pass through on the way to somewhere else, never realizing the forest on their left is bigger than some national parks and older than most towns in this state. People say the trees here grow crooked because the land remembers things humans were never meant to see. Local folklore mostly, but every lie has a seed of truth buried somewhere inside it. My father used to say that the forest isn't meant to be conquered, it's meant to be survived. Back then, I thought he was talking about storms, bears, or the endless winters. But the longer I've worn this uniform, the more I've learned that what lives in the forest isn't always flesh and blood. Sometimes it's something else, something that waits for you to slip up, to doubt yourself, to look too long at the spaces between the trees. And once it knows your fear, it never forgets your name. My job began like any other night shift. Routine. Predictable. A cold October evening with temperatures dropping faster than expected. The sky had that deep bruised color it gets right before the sun disappears entirely. I signed out the truck, double-checked the gear in the back, thermal blanket, lantern, medical kit, and my rifle, and headed down the gravel road towards Sector 6. That area had a reputation among rangers, not because of anything official, but because people got a strange feeling when they were out there alone. Radios cut out. Temperatures dropped suddenly. And sometimes, rarely but consistently, hikers reported sounds that didn't belong to any animal we knew. I'd chalked most of it up to the forest playing tricks on them. Echoes bouncing the wrong way, wind slipping through fissures in the rocks, the human brain doing what it does best, filling in the gaps with things that weren't there. But experience has a way of reshaping your certainty. The first call came just as I reached the northern ridge. 3 hikers overdue from their trail loop. 2 women, 1 man, all from out of state. The voicemail they'd left hours earlier mentioned something strange. They'd heard a screaming whistle, something like a human voice stretched too thin, moving through the trees. The kind of detail I would normally dismiss as nerves or exaggeration. I contacted dispatch, confirmed their route, and began my search. At first, the forest was so still it felt staged. The kind of silence that presses against you like it's waiting for something. My radio crackled every few minutes, but the signal was weak. I checked in with habit more than hope. I wasn't afraid yet, not then. But unease has a way of tugging at you, one small thread at a time. I parked the truck at the trailhead, grabbed my pack, and began the climb. The moon was barely visible, swallowed by clouds that looked thick enough to touch. My breath fogged with every exhale, the cold settling into my bones faster than it should have. The forest floor was layered with wet leaves that muffled my footsteps. Half a mile up, I found tracks, 3 sets heading deeper into the pines, exactly as expected. Nothing unusual. Yet the deeper I followed them, the more I felt it, that subtle shift in the air pressure, like walking into a room where a fight just happened. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was wounded, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept walking. At the mile mark, the first sign of trouble appeared, a discarded glove lying beside a fallen log. Not torn, not chewed, just placed there, palm up, as if someone had dropped it while reaching for something or someone. I crouched, picked it up, and turned slowly, checking for movement. Nothing. No rustling. No breathing. Not even a squirrel clicking in the branches. When I lifted my head, that's when I noticed something strange. Every tree in the area leaned ever so slightly in the same direction. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to unsettle you once you saw it, like they'd grown under the influence of a strong, consistent wind that hadn't existed for centuries. I radioed in again. Static swallowed my words. That's when the knocking started. A single hollow tap echoed through the trees behind me. Then another. Slow. Measured. Not woodpecker fast. Not random. It was deliberate. Too deliberate. The kind of knock a person would make on a front door, waiting for someone to answer. I froze. My first instinct was to rationalize. Could have been a branch falling. Could have been an animal. Could have been anything ordinary. But then it knocked again. 2 quick raps followed by a third that sounded too heavy, too intentional. Like it was mimicking something. "Hello," I called out. The forest threw my voice back at me, but the echo sounded warped, like it was coming from the wrong direction. I tightened my grip on my flashlight. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. I moved forward, scanning between the trees. The darkness thickened ahead of me, the air turning colder with every step. My breath came out in sharp clouds, and the hair on my arms lifted under my jacket. That's when the smell hit me. An acrid metallic scent, like rust mixed with something older, something that didn't belong in the open air. A smell that reminded me of caves, damp stone, stagnant air, something left underground for too long. I pushed forward, driven by equal parts duty and instinct. The tracks ahead looked frantic, scattered leaves, disturbed soil, broken branches. Someone had run. Recently, desperately. But then I noticed the problem. The tracks stopped. No struggle, no blood, no drag marks. They simply ended at the mouth of a narrow ravine. I stepped closer, shining my light inside. The rocks were smooth, almost polished, as if something had passed through them repeatedly. The ravine was barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways, and the deeper it went, the darker it became. Dark in a way that swallowed the beam of my flashlight. And then, from somewhere inside the ravine, I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to any living creature. It started as a low, vibrating hum, like something exhaling slowly through a hollow bone. Then it shifted, bending upward into a pitch so sharp it felt like it pierced my skull. A sound too structured to be wind, too resonant to be an animal call, too unnatural to be anything I'd ever heard in my life. It echoed out of the ravine and into the forest, making the trees shiver. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was denial. Pure, stubborn denial. My brain tried to reshape the sound into something familiar. A coyote, a mountain lion, a gust of wind catching the rocks. But no matter what shape I forced it into, nothing fit. Nothing human could make that sound, nothing natural would want to. And yet, it was calling to something, or someone. I stepped back, pulse pounding, trying to decide whether to retreat or press forward. My training told me to wait for backup. My instincts told me to run. But the ranger in me, the part that knew people were missing, probably terrified, maybe dying, refused to leave. I steadied my breath. And I stepped into the ravine. The walls of the ravine closed around me immediately, squeezing out what little light filtered from the forest canopy behind me. My shoulders brushed cold stone on either side, and the smell grew stronger, earthy, metallic, stale. It felt like breathing in the air of something that hadn't been disturbed in centuries. I kept my flashlight raised, though its beams seemed to bend strangely, as if the darkness swallowed parts of it before it could reach the rock ahead. I took another step. The ground sloped downward, forcing my weight forward. My boots scraped against gravel and something softer underneath. Moss, maybe? Or something that felt like moss but reacted differently, compressing underfoot with a faint give, like stepping on an old sponge. My breath echoed softly off the walls, bouncing back to me with an unnatural delay, just long enough to make it feel like someone else was breathing behind me. I stopped and listened. The forest outside was completely silent now, replaced by the soft subterranean hum that pulsed from deeper within the ravine. It wasn't constant, more like waves, building and falling, each cycle slightly different from the last, as though the sound had a mind of its own. With every rise in pitch, I felt my heartbeat respond, sinking to something I didn't understand. A part of me knew I should turn around, but the pitch shifted again, this time warping into a brief, almost pleading note that raised every hair on my neck. It sounded closer now, less like something echoing from the end of a tunnel, and more like something inhaling just beyond the reach of my light. I forced my legs to keep moving. The ravine widened abruptly after several yards, opening into a chamber formed naturally by the stone. My light revealed jagged shadows stretching into narrow tunnels branching off in multiple directions. But what stopped me wasn't the shape of the cavern, it was what coated the walls. Scratches. Thousands of them. Deep, erratic grooves carved into the rock. Some long, some short, some overlapping each other so densely they formed chaotic patterns like animal claw marks. But others were unmistakably made by human hands. I stepped closer, angling the light. Fingernail scratches. Desperate. Frightening. Dragging down the wall in thin, frantic streaks until they vanished toward the floor. I crouched, my throat tightening. A scrap of fabric lay half buried in the dirt, maroon in color, torn from a jacket. The hiker's description came back to me. One of the women was wearing red. A wave of guilt punched through my chest, hot and heavy. They'd been here. They'd been alive long enough to leave marks, long enough to claw at the stone until their fingers bled. I reached for my radio again. Static. But beneath the static, like a layer underneath the noise, I heard something else. A rhythmic pattern, soft and distant, like someone tapping metal with a bone. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. A scraping sound. A message. Or a lure. Hello? My voice cracked. The sound bounced off the cavern walls with that same unnatural delay. If you can hear me, call out. Nothing. I shone the light across the scratches again, tracing them upward. That's when I noticed something carved above the cluster. Letters, shallow but deliberate. At first, I couldn't make them out through the dust and grime. I wiped the stone with my glove, squinting at the jagged etchings. Do not follow the sound. The words were uneven, hurried, like someone carved them in darkness, pit against stone, praying they had enough time to finish. My stomach dropped. I heard a crunch behind me. I spun, shining the flashlight back toward the ravine entrance. Nothing moved. But the sound came again, softer this time, closer. A shift in the gravel. A slow drag like someone pulling their foot across the ground. Identify yourself, I shouted. Silence. Then very faintly, a breath. Human. Or what tried to sound human. I raised my weapon, my flashlight trembling in my other hand. Stay where you are. Silence again. And then, unmistakable, something whispered my name. Not loud, not shouted, whispered. Spoken like someone repeating a word they had only heard and never used before. The pronunciation was off, slightly distorted, the vowels stretched wrong. Mar-cus. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I'd never felt fear like that. Not even when I faced down a charging moose or got lost in a whiteout storm 30 miles from the station. This wasn't instinctive fear. This was something older, primal, the kind of terror that sinks into your body like cold water. No living creature makes that sound. I backed toward the nearest tunnel, but the moment my light passed through its entrance, the humming returned, louder now. More focused. It vibrated in my teeth, in my skull, and my spine. It felt like it was pushing me away or warning me or preparing me for something worse. The whisper came again, closer. Mur-cus. The voice had no warmth, no breath behind the consonants. It sounded like something scraping the idea of my name against stone. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. Who's there? A pause. Then a long, hollow exhale that chilled the sweat on the back of my neck. I stepped backward, accidentally kicking loose a rock that clattered across the cavern floor. The sound echoed unnaturally. Warped, distant, yet overwhelming. The tunnels seemed to catch the noise and stretch it like something alive. I aimed the flashlight again, sweeping it slowly across the chamber. Still nothing. But as the beam crossed the far wall, the hum suddenly sharpened, rising into that impossible pitch that didn't belong to anything that had ever lived. The stone vibrated under my hand, dust falling in thin streams from the ceiling. The sound wasn't coming from the tunnels anymore. It was coming from deeper, beneath the ground. The cavern floor trembled with faint, rhythmic pulses, like something massive shifting far below. A presence, a warning, or a hunger. I stumbled backward until my spine hit the cavern wall. The scratches dug into my jacket. A strange chill seeped through the stone, numbing my skin. I could feel my breath growing shorter, my pulse louder. A cold realization settled into my bones. I wasn't alone down here. I wasn't even the one being hunted. I was being studied, watched, called. Something shifted in the darkness again, this time clearly, something dragging its weight across rock. Then a second sound, a soft, wet clicking, like joints moving in ways they weren't meant to. The whispering voice echoed again, not my name this time, but something else, something I couldn't understand. It sounded older, heavier, like a language carved into the earth itself. And then a shape moved, barely, a shadow, darker than the rest, peeling itself from the far corner of the chamber. My flashlight flickered the moment the beam touched it, once, twice, then flared bright as if desperate to expose it. The shape retreated from the light, not quickly, not fearfully, but slowly, with a deliberate caution that felt wrong, like a creature mimicking an instinct it didn't fully comprehend. A massive silhouette, hunched, too tall to be a person, too controlled to be an animal. Its outline shuddered slightly, as if its form struggled to stay contained within its own skin. My breath caught in my throat. The thing lifted its head taller, and the ceiling trembled dust loose. I took a single step back. The creature mirrored me. Exactly. In perfect rhythm. Not instinct, imitation, like it was learning me. The light flickered again, and in that brief, stuttering moment of darkness, the sound returned. Not a hum, not a whisper, but a deep, resonant call that defied every rule of life. A sound no living creature makes. It filled the cavern, pressed into my temples, like forced my breath short. The scratches on the walls seemed to vibrate with it. The warning etched above them seemed to pulse. Do not follow the sound. I realized too late. I already had. The moment the truth hit me, that I'd done exactly what the warning begged me not to do, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I pushed away from the wall, slipping on loose gravel as the creature took one slow, deliberate step toward me. The cavern seemed to shrink with every inch it closed, the air thickening with a pressure that felt almost gravitational. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam skittering across the jagged stone before finally landing on the creature's legs. That's when I saw the tracks, human shoe prints. 3 sets, all leading toward the far side of the cavern, not away. The hikers had run deeper into the cave toward whatever this thing was. Why? Why would anyone move closer to something like this? Unless they hadn't been running toward anything at all. Unless they'd been pulled. The creature shifted again, and the clicking of its joints echoed through the chamber. Its movements were too smooth in some places, too jagged in others, like a predator imitating the motions of prey. My pulse hammered through my ears, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. The sound it made earlier, the impossible hollow call, began to build again, low and rumbling, as if gathering in its chest. No, not chest. It didn't breathe. It didn't inhale. It didn't exhale. I realized it with freezing clarity. Its torso never rose, never fell. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the mechanics of life. I took one step sideways, keeping my light trained on it. If I could get to the opposite tunnel, just one of the side passages, I might be able to lose it in the maze. Even if I didn't escape, I needed to find the hikers. If they were alive, if they were still themselves. The hum rose, gaining layers like multiple voices blending into one. I moved again, slow, careful, controlled. The creature mimicked me exactly, tilting its massive body the same number of inches, matching my pace with eerie precision as if learning through repetition. The motion was wrong, the timing too perfect, like a delayed reflection catching up. "Stay back," I whispered, though I knew words meant nothing here. My voice hit the cavern wall and returned with that uncanny echo, lagged, stretched, hollow. The creature's head jerked slightly at the sound, reacting not to my voice, but to the echo of it. Like the mimicry wasn't only visual, like it listened differently than any living thing. I made a decision I still don't fully understand, whether it was instinct, desperation, or stupidity. I hurled my flashlight to the right, deep into the far tunnel. The creature lunged after the sound. Not the light, not the motion, the sound. It slammed against the cavern floor, skidding on long limbs that bent in ways bones shouldn't. The hum cut short, replaced by a wet scraping sound as it crawled toward the clattering light. I ran. The moment its attention shifted, I bolted toward the left passage, my only option. The darkness swallowed me whole. I felt the stone brush my shoulders, my forearms scraping through my jacket. My boots hit uneven ground, my breath bursting out in sharp clouds that fogged the stale air. Behind me, the hum returned. But this time it wasn't deep and resonant. It was higher, closer, faster. A chorus of echoes followed it, not from multiple creatures, but from the cave itself. Like the stone was mimicking the sound in layers, reflecting it forward, sideways, behind me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The tunnel split ahead, left or right. I chose left. Something scraped behind me, fast, rhythmic, gaining. The walls vibrated with each echo of the impossible call. The tunnel narrowed, and I felt rough stone rip across my arm, cutting through the fabric of my sleeve. My footsteps weren't echoing, they were being swallowed. The sound chasing me grew sharper, like bone dragged along metal. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct I had, every survival sense, told me that if I looked behind me, if I hesitated for even a breath, I wouldn't make it another step. The tunnel twisted, then dropped sharply. I didn't see the decline until I was already falling. My foot slipped, my weight pitched forward, and I slid down a steep, twisting chute of smooth stone. My hands scraped along the walls, unable to grip. I hit the bottom hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. I lay there, gasping. The hum stopped. The cavern ahead was pitch black, so dark it felt solid. The air was colder here, unnaturally cold, like something breathed frost into the stone. I pulled myself upright, ribs aching, letting my eyes adjust, and then I saw them. 3 silhouettes, standing perfectly still in the darkness. My breath caught. "Hello?" My voice cracked, trembling. The figures didn't move. I raised my hand, trying to generate enough friction to spark my lighter. It took 3 tries before the flame flickered to life, casting a small, trembling light. The 3 hikers stood before me, Allah at least, standing. Their eyes were wide, pupils blown, their chests unmoving. Their skin was pale, not from cold light, but from something deeper, like the life had been drained out of them. Their faces were slack with shock or terror or both. The man in the middle twitched, not his whole body, just his jaw as though remembering how to move. When his lips parted, no breath came out, no sound, no cry for help, just a hollow, broken whistle. The same pitch as the creature, the same impossible sound. My lighter shook violently in my hand. What did it do to you? None of them blinked. None of them shifted, but all 3 slowly lifted an arm, a single synchronized motion pointing deeper into the cavern behind them. "No," I whispered. "No, I'm not going in there." The woman on the left tilted her head, her neck cracking sharply. Then she repeated my word, exactly as I said it. "No." The voice wasn't hers. It was mine. Perfectly mimicked. The lighter flame sputtered. Their mouths opened in unison, wider and wider, stretching too far, too wrong, until their lips split at the corners. And then the impossible sound poured out of them, not from lungs, not from throats, from somewhere deeper. The stone trembled, the air thickened. Behind them the darkness shifted, something massive rising, unfolding, its shape scraping the top of the cavern. A long limb, too long, dragged forward with a wet, grinding crack. The creature had found me again. The hikers weren't pointing the way out. They were pointing the way to it. I stumbled backward as the hum rose into a shriek that felt like it pierced straight through my spine. The cavern shook. Stone cracked overhead. A rush of cold air exploded past me as the creature lunged, and I ran. I ran without direction, without thought, without breath. I ran the way animals run when the world behind them is no longer survivable. My boots slammed against stone, my lungs burning, the echo of that impossible sound chasing me through the labyrinth of tunnels like a physical force. I didn't know where the passage went. I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from the thing that should never have learned my name. The tunnel tightened around me, pressing my shoulders inward until I had to turn sideways just to keep moving. Every breath scraped cold air down my throat. My palms dragged along jagged stone, guiding me through the pitch-black passage as the shrieking hum rolled through the cave behind me. Closer now. Impossibly close. The sound didn't fade with distance. It multiplied, layered, folded over itself like a storm of voices, all learning the same terrible language. I could feel it, vibrating through the stone, through the air, through my bones. It wasn't chasing me, it was surrounding me. The tunnel forked again, but I never saw it coming. My hands swept into empty space on the right, and momentum carried me sideways. I stumbled through the narrow break, only realizing I'd chosen a path when the hum behind me briefly dipped, as though the creature had paused to listen. Then, silence. No hum, no scraping, no echo. Just the slow, steady drip of water somewhere deep in the dark. I froze. My heartbeat punched through my ribs. Silence was worse. Silence meant it knew where I was. I squeezed through the new tunnel, every inch of my body brushing cold stone. The air felt different here, denser, wet, carrying a faint metallic scent that clung to my tongue. It reminded me of old pennies and rain-soaked iron. My boots touched something slick, a thin film across the ground. Water. No. Thicker than water. I crouched, letting my fingers hover just above the surface. Even without touching it, I could smell the truth. Blood. Diluted, embedded into the stone. A cavern opened ahead, large, impossibly large. I stepped inside, my hands sliding along the wall for balance. For a moment, I thought the darkness was empty. Then my eyes adjusted. Carvings covered the chamber, thousands of them, like spiraling from floor to ceiling. Deep grooves forming symbols, faces, distorted human shapes interwoven with things larger, leaner, crawling along the edges of the stone in unnatural poses. It looked like the inside of the cave had been rewritten, transformed into a record of something ancient, something that existed long before any ranger station, any trail, any map. The walls hummed faintly, as if the carvings themselves whispered. I approached one symbol, an oval shape with jagged lines radiating from it like a mouth that stretched too wide. Deep scratches inside resembled teeth, dozens of them, uneven and chaotic. My skin crawled. This wasn't art, it was memory. Something carved its existence into the earth. My breathing accelerated. I could barely hear myself over the pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run blindly until the cave spat me out somewhere in the forest. But I couldn't. Not yet. Something glimmered near the base of the far wall. I knelt, sweeping my hand along the dirt until my fingers brushed fabric, frayed, muddy, stiff. I lifted it carefully. A jacket. Red. The same shade the hikers described. Beside it lay a boot, small, scuffed, laces torn. A second lay a few inches away, shredded along the side. A flashlight, cracked. A phone, screen shattered, and deeper still, a necklace with a tiny silver leaf charm bent almost in half. They'd been here. They'd been dragged here. My chest tightened. I whispered into the silence, "I'm so sorry." The words echoed strangely, warped, twisted, returning to me in a low, unfamiliar tone. A mockery of grief. A mimic. The humming rose again, slowly, intentionally. Every carving on the wall seemed to vibrate, dust falling in thin streams as the stone trembled. The air thickened, the temperature dropping so fast frost traced across the rock in white, jagged veins. Something moved behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The weight of its presence pressed into my back like a hand squeezing my spine. My body shook with instinctive terror, the kind born long before language, long before thought. The hum shifted, gaining a rhythm, a pulse, matching my heartbeat, matching my breathing, learning me. Then, soft, almost tender, it whispered, "Mercus." My blood froze. It was closer than ever. I forced myself to stand, legs trembling so violently my knees nearly buckled. My vision tunneled. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Even the air refused to move. I turned, slowly, because anything sudden might trigger the thing that watched me from the darkness. The creature stood half hidden behind a column of stone, its silhouette massive and crooked, limbs too long, shoulders too narrow. Its head scraped the cavern ceiling, bending slightly to fit. Its eyes, if it had any, didn't shine or reflect my dim glow. Instead, the space where eyes should be seemed to swallow light. The hum built inside its chest, not real breath, but something mimicking breath. I realized then why its earlier calls sounded so warped, like a flute carved out of bone. It wasn't making the sound itself. The cave was. The stone resonated with it, amplifying its voice, speaking for it. This thing didn't hunt using strength, it hunted using the earth. The hiker's shoes prints flashed in my mind, leading deeper, not away. They hadn't been chasing anything, they'd been following a sound that guided them like a whispered command, and now it wanted me to follow too. The creature leaned forward, its outlines stretching. The hum rose until the carvings around us vibrated with a high, shimmering ring. My teeth ached, my fingertips went numb. Before I could take a step back, the stone behind me cracked just slightly, dust spilling down my neck. It wasn't trapping me, it was closing its hand. "I'm not going with you," I whispered, though my voice shook so badly it barely counted as speech. The creature mirrored my tilt of the head. Then it whispered in the exact tone I'd used, "I'm not going with you." Hearing my own voice echo back, twisted through something inhuman, broke something inside me. I swallowed hard, brain scrambling for any way out. Any chance, any direction. There was only one. The tunnel I came from. Narrow, jagged, angled upward at a steep incline. It wasn't an exit, but it was the only path that wasn't deeper. I stepped backward, slow and deliberate. The creature's head twitched, its limbs unfolded, then it lunged. I ran. I sprinted harder than I've ever run in my life, every muscle igniting in raw panic. The hum erupted into a shriek that split the air, rattling the stone so violently that slabs fell from the ceiling. One crashed inches from my heels, sending dust exploding upward. The tunnel tightened around me. Like scraping my arms, my ribs, I squeezed through, ignoring the rip of fabric and skin. Behind me, something massive slammed into the stone, the entire cavern shaking. The creature couldn't fit, but the sound could. The shriek barreled through the tunnel like a physical force. My ears rang. Blood seeped warm down my neck. I stumbled, crawled, clawed my way upward until cold night air brushed faintly against my face. A sliver of moonlight. An exit. I lunged toward it just as the light behind me vanished, blocked by something filling the tunnel's mouth. A long, pale limb squeezed through the narrow gap, joints cracking, stone crumbling as it reached. I screamed, pure, primal, terrified, and hurled myself through the opening. The forest erupted into cold night air. I tumbled onto moss and leaves, rolling until I hit a fallen log. I scrambled to my feet, breath tearing from my lungs. Behind me, the ravine entrance pulsed with that impossible sound, a mournful howl that didn't belong to anything living. The trees vibrated, the ground trembled. Then silence. I waited. Seconds. A minute. 5. Nothing emerged. Whatever lived in that cave stayed there or slept there or waited there. I didn't walk back to the station that night. I ran. I ran until my legs buckled beneath me, and even then I crawled the last half mile, terrified that if I slowed down, I'd hear the forest calling my name again. When the rescue team arrived the next morning, the ravine had collapsed, the entrance sealed by tons of stone, no sign of the hikers, no sign of the creature, no sign of the carvings, the chamber, the warnings, just silence. Deep, ancient silence. They wrote the case up as an unresolved disappearance. But I know better, because sometimes late at night when the wind sweeps down from the ridge just right, I still hear it. A hollow call drifting through the trees, something learning, something remembering, something waiting. And every time the sound echoes across the forest, one thought sinks deeper into my bones. No living creature makes that sound. The night I learned that fear has a temperature, it wasn't the cold that warned me. It was the heat rising from beneath my boots. My name is Cole. I'm 35 years old, but sometimes the forest makes me feel younger than I deserve to be, like it can strip years off me just by forcing me back into the most primitive version of myself. I've been a park ranger in the Northern Rockies for a long time, long enough to think I knew the language of pine groans and avalanche cracks and the distant thunder of shifting ice. Long enough to know when a storm is lying or when an animal is telling the truth simply by the way it breathes, but not long enough to recognize when the land itself is watching me back. The locals in the small mountain towns around the district, old families with thicker accents and older grudges, always told me the same thing when I first joined the ranger station. Don't follow heat in winter. Back then, I laughed. Heat meant life, rescue, a sign someone might need help. But those warnings weren't about survival tactics. They were stories layered with something older, worn smooth from being repeated across too many generations. I dismissed most folklore the way a young ranger dismisses frostbite, something that happens to careless people, not to them. That arrogance stayed with me for years. It let me believe that experience was a shield, that logic was armor. It worked well enough, until the night I broke the first rule the mountain ever whispered to me. Don't follow heat in winter. That night began like so many others, with a storm coming in from the west, and the kind of wind that could lift fresh snow into spirals that looked almost alive. I was on night patrol, checking the outer trails after a pair of hikers claimed they heard something heavy moving parallel to them the night before. Their description was vague, bipedal, but too slow for a bear, too steady for a moose. I chalked it up to nerves. Storms always make the woods sound bigger, stranger. But I still logged it, and when the snow rolled in earlier than expected, I headed out with my lantern and pack, planning to do one sweep of the tree line before the real weather hit. The forest felt wrong the moment I stepped off the service road. Not dangerous, just observed. There's a specific kind of silence that doesn't exist anywhere outside of deep winter forests. It's not just absence of noise, it's a vacuum, a pulling quiet, as if sound itself freezes before it reaches your ears. That night, the silence had a pulse, like it thickened around me when I took a step forward and loosened when I stopped. It reminded me of standing too close to a speaker before the bass drops, pressure without sound. I told myself it was just the storm shifting air in the pines. I always told myself something. My lantern threw a soft orange arc across the first few yards of trail, illuminating snowflakes that seemed to fall slower than usual. The wind hadn't started yet, not really, and everything felt suspended, as though the forest hadn't decided whether to breathe. That was when I saw it. Steam. A faint ripple rising from the ground 20 feet ahead of me, like the earth exhaled a warm breath and it froze midway up. I blinked hard. Snow fell onto the spot but melted instantly, revealing a dark patch of earth exposed beneath the white surface. This was impossible. The temperature was well below zero. The ground should have been locked in permafrost. There was no geothermal activity in this region, not at this elevation, not with this rock structure. We would have known. We would have documented it. But the ground was warm. I knelt down, hesitating before extending my gloved hand. The warmth radiated through the leather like a living pulse. And stronger than that warmth was a smell, a faint, metallic sweetness like blood left near a campfire. I pulled my hand back. Something deep inside me, older than training, older than logic, whispered that the heat wasn't natural. It wasn't environmental. It was intentional. The forest inhaled around me, a shift so subtle I might have imagined it, but I felt it in the fine hairs at the back of my neck rising. I checked for animal tracks, but the snow around the warm patch was untouched. No prints, no crushed underbrush, no drag marks, just the steady release of vapor. Then I heard it, a crack of a branch deeper in the trees. Slow, deliberate. I straightened immediately, lantern swinging. The forest swallowed the light fast, but I saw enough. the silhouettes of trees shifting ever so slightly as if something large moved among them with the patience of a predator. I forced myself to breathe. Storms play tricks. Visibility drops, sounds bounce, shadows lean where they shouldn't, but the scent changed next. It drifted across the trail in a wave, a cold, wet animal smell mixed with something sour, something that prickled the inside of my throat. I'd never smelled anything like it, and I have cataloged every scent from deer rutting to a carcass bloating under the sun. This wasn't familiar. It wasn't even close. Another branch cracked, this one closer. Something was walking. Not crashing through the snow the way a bear does, not bounding the way elk sometimes do when they're spooked. The steps were measured, almost soundless except for the occasional brittle snap of a twig being pushed aside. That was when Denial, my old companion, tried to talk its way in. Probably just a moose, maybe even a stray horse from a ranch. Snow dampens sound, distorts distance. Don't jump to conclusions. But the cadence of the steps was wrong. Moose wade through snow. Horses stomp. Bears drag weight. This was something upright. The steam patch behind me gave a low hiss, and for a moment I felt, not heard, felt, a pressure underfoot like something enormous shifted far beneath the soil, warming it with the friction of movement. My breath hitched. I took a step back. I didn't even realize I'd done it until I saw my boot print beside the exposed earth. The warmth grew stronger, bleeding through the snow around it. And then the first sound came, not from ahead of me, but from behind. A low, resonant hum, human-like, but too deep, too steady, too close. I spun around, lantern raised, and the forest looked exactly the same, frozen, pale, indifferent. But the hum didn't stop. It vibrated the air, vibrating me, sinking into my chest until my ribs felt brittle. And for a heartbeat, I smelled something impossible, like wet fur mixed with hot stone, as if an animal had lived underground long enough to sweat minerals. I told myself to move, to call dispatch, to step back toward the road, but my legs locked, not out of paralysis, out of recognition. Recognition. The sound wasn't new. I'd heard it once before, years ago. Deep in a cave I promised myself I'd never go back to. The memory hit me so violently that I swayed. The cave. The lost boy. The footprint too large to belong to any known species. The strange warmth on the rocks. The hum echoing through the stone like a heartbeat from the mountain itself. I'd buried that memory so deep that even I questioned it. But the forest brought it back now, raw and vivid, because whatever had made that sound in the cave was making it again, right here, above ground. Another step. This one so close the lantern glass trembled, the warmth under my feet pulsed, the hum deepened, and the forest, for the first time in my entire career, felt alive in a way that made my body understand something long before my mind caught up. I was not the watcher tonight. I was the intruder, and something beneath the snow was waking up. The hum grew so dense it felt like I was standing inside a throat. Every breath I took tasted warmer, heavier, as if the cold around me had been pushed back by something rising from beneath the surface. The storm above had not yet broken, but flakes spiraled wildly, caught in a strange updraft that seemed to come from the ground rather than the sky. I backed away slowly, the lantern trembling in my hand. Snow shifted behind me, soft, deliberate, like a body moving through powder with the confidence of something that had done this 1,000 times. I turned, and for the briefest moment I caught a silhouette between the pines. Too tall. Its head nearly brushed a low branch that would have forced any normal animal to duck. But it didn't duck. It simply moved, fluid, patient, like it knew I was already too late to pretend I hadn't seen it. A large shadow isn't frightening on its own. It's the silence around it that does the damage. The creature's steps made almost no sound, which was impossible given its size. The snow should have crunched, the branches should have rustled, but the only noise was that steady, suffocating hum weaving between the trees. That hum was a voice. I didn't want to admit it, but my body knew. My breath shortened. My palms sweated inside my gloves. Every instinct I had, every hour of training, every year of familiarity, collapsed against a single truth. Whatever was in those trees wasn't just an animal. Something inside me whispered a name from childhood stories, a word the older rangers used to joke about during late-night coffee at the station. Half folklore, half warning. A creature that lived beneath glaciers, under mountains, in frozen caverns where sunlight never dared to intrude. They never used the word with seriousness, not once. Yeti. But that wasn't the word they used up here. The locals said something different, something older and harder to pronounce. I could hear old Mrs. Haskett saying it in my memory, softly, like the forest might overhear her. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet. The shadow shifted again, leaning slightly, as though studying me. I forced myself to move, not away, but sideways, like I was giving space rather than fleeing. Predators react to flight. At least the ones I understood did. I couldn't be sure this one followed the same rules. My radio cracked softly at my hip, sudden and sharp, and I flinched. That tiny movement made the shadow straighten fully, rising to a height that turned my stomach. No bear on earth was that tall, and no man was that broad at the shoulders. I swallowed hard and reached slowly for the radio, careful not to make any sudden movements. Static buzzed through the receiver, soft at first, then warping into a strange oscillation, the same pitch as the hum around me. My hand froze halfway to the device. It wasn't malfunctioning, it was responding. The hum intensified, and the ground heated beneath me again. The steam rose faster now, curling around my ankles like fingers. My breath clouded in front of me, but dissipated too fast, eaten away by the heat that should not have existed. I moved backward one small step, then another. The shadow stepped forward. This time the snow did crunch, soft but undeniable. And the sound wasn't the crisp snap of ice. It was a wet, heavy compression, like something dragging weight beneath the snow's surface. I lifted my lantern higher, its trembling glow catching the edge of pale fur, barely visible between the branches, but enough to make my chest tighten. It wasn't clean white like a mountain goat's coat. It was off-white, tinted with the gray of weathered bone. Then a sound broke the air that froze me solid, a low, resonant knock. Knuckles, massive, deliberate, striking a tree trunk. Once, twice, 3 times. The same pattern the hikers had reported. The same pattern I'd heard in the cave years ago. The same pattern that had been knocking at the back of my skull ever since I stepped near the warm patch in the snow. This wasn't a random animal call. This was communication. The knocks echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees in unnatural ways, as if the woods themselves were repeating them back. Each echo grew softer but deeper, vibrating through the warmth under my boots. It felt like the forest was answering. I did something I'm not proud of. I ran. Not blindly. I stayed on the trail, boots kicking up powder as I moved as quietly as I could, while still retreating. My breath roared in my ears. The lantern bounced wildly in my hand. I didn't dare look back, but every instinct screamed that the shadow was following. The warmth faded as I moved, replaced instantly by a blast of cold so brutal it stabbed through my coat and into my ribs. It felt personal, punishment for leaving, for disobeying. I stumbled through the sudden temperature shift, gasping. Behind me, the knocks started again, slower this time. Rhythmic, measured. They weren't chasing me. They were calling. I reached the service road just as the first gust of the storm hit, scattering snow in hard, needling sheets. The comforting familiarity of the road didn't calm me. If anything, it made me feel exposed. I killed the lantern, letting the darkness swallow its orange halo, and fumbled for my flashlight. My hands were shaking too badly to press the switch. That was when the second scent hit, stronger, closer, unmistakable. Hot earth, wet stone, and something like burnt fur drifting on the wind. I forced myself to turn. The forest edge was barely visible through the storm, a wall of black trees twisting in the wind. But something moved against that darkness, a slow, deliberate sway just beyond the first layer of trunks, too big to hide, yet somehow hiding. I raised the flashlight, thumb trembling against the switch. The beam flickered on. For a fraction of a second, I saw them. Eyes. Not glowing, not animal bright, dull, reflective, deep set. 2 wet stones staring through me rather than at me. I jerked back, heart slamming so hard my knees buckled. The flashlight beam wavered, and when it steadied, the eyes were gone. The shadow had melted backward into the trees with a grace no creature that size should have possessed. The knocks had stopped. The hum had stopped. The warmth was gone. The forest returned to winter silence, but the damage was done. I staggered backward toward the ranger truck parked at the road's edge, every breath coming out in sharp bursts. My mind tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Height exaggeration from shadows, misidentification due to the storm, some large predator displaced by weather, the echo distortion of the mountains, but none of it held. Not when I'd smelled the warmth, not when the ground had pulsed beneath my boots, not when the radio had synced with the hum, not when I'd seen those eyes. The creature wasn't wandering, it wasn't hunting, it was watching. I climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and locked it out of instinct alone. My pulse thundered. My hands shook too hard to put the keys into the ignition. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the tree line, waiting for the shadow to reappear. It didn't. Instead, another memory surfaced, the cave, the boy who disappeared, and the footprint we found pressed deep into the clay beneath the snow, a print that didn't belong to any animal documented in our wildlife registry. Now, all these years later, the same scent, the same warmth, the same knock echoed in the forest above ground. It hadn't been a cave encounter. It had been a warning, a reminder, a beginning. I swallowed, both hands gripping the steering wheel. Outside, the snowfall thickened, swirling against the glass like thousands of tiny hands clawing for entry. And beneath everything, beneath the storm and the silence and the tree line, I felt it again. A faint vibration, far below, deep under the earth. A tremor that didn't come from tectonic plates or shifting ice, a tremor that felt like movement, as if something buried was pushing upward, as if the creature I'd seen wasn't alone, as if an entire world beneath the snow was waking. A shiver crawled up my spine, colder than any winter wind. The ground had been warm, not because of geothermal heat, not because of weather patterns, but because something down there was alive. And it was getting closer. I drove back to the station with the storm swallowing the road so quickly I could barely see past the hood. The wipers scraped at the ice forming along the edges of the windshield, fighting a losing battle. Every few seconds, the truck's tires slid just enough to remind me that the world outside was shifting, tilting, refusing to follow the laws it normally obeyed. But the danger on the road wasn't what made my knuckles white around the steering wheel. It was the feeling, no, the certainty, that something was following beneath me, not above the snow, under it. A faint thrum that traveled up through the tires, a pulsing that matched the hum I'd heard in the trees. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, slow, rhythmic waves, like the creature beneath the ground was pacing me, keeping to my speed, matching my path. Each vibration was a reminder. You didn't escape. You just moved. I pressed the gas harder. The truck fishtailed, corrected, and surged forward, engine whining. The vibration faded, or maybe the storm swallowed it. I couldn't tell. By the time I reached the ranger station, my breath had become one solid ache in my chest. The building's lights glowed faintly through the whiteout, hazy and distant, like lanterns underwater. I pulled into the lot too fast, slamming the brakes hard enough to skid, and when the truck jolted to a stop, the silence in its wake felt obscene. No hum, no vibration, just the storm. I sat there for a long moment, fighting the urge to call someone, anyone, just to hear a voice that wasn't buried in the snow. But what would I say? There was a creature in the woods, the ground warmed like a furnace, the forest was humming at me. The others already joked that I took local legends too seriously. If I told them what I'd seen tonight, I'd become the joke. And worse, someone would want proof. Someone would want to go back there. I couldn't let them. I forced myself out of the truck, boots sinking into the snow as the wind clawed at my back. The station door slammed behind me with a hollow thud. Inside, the dim light of the lobby felt almost foreign, too warm and too human for what my senses were still screaming. I peeled off my gloves, flexing fingers stiff from cold and fear, and went straight to the radio desk. My hand hovered over the main dispatch mic, but I didn't touch it. Calling in a possible creature sighting would trigger protocols. Drone sweeps, wildlife response teams, armed wardens. They weren't prepared for what I'd seen tonight. Hell, I wasn't prepared, and I'd faced avalanches, forest fires, a cougar that nearly took my arm, and once, a man who tried to use the woods as a place to disappear his crimes. But I'd never faced something that wasn't supposed to exist. I stepped back from the radio. My breath steadied. My heartbeat didn't. I turned toward the hallway that led to my quarters, but halfway down the corridor, I stopped. My boots had left a trail of snow melt across the tile. Normal. But mixed with the wet footprints was something else. A smell. Not strong. Barely there. But familiar enough to turn my stomach. Earth. Stone. Burnt fur. Fresh. Spun around. Scanning the lobby. The door was closed. Locked. Snow piled against the frame. No tracks around the building. No broken window. Nothing disturbed. But the scent hadn't been on me when I entered. It was new. I followed the smell, not toward the entrance, but toward the stairwell that led to the lower storage rooms. The scent thickened with every step, burning the back of my throat. I clutched the railing, my palms slick with sweat. Halfway down, a draft of hot air rolled past me. Hot, in the middle of a storm. I froze. This was impossible. The lower level was insulated, cold, and locked tight. No heat source down there, no vents, no exposed pipes. But the air coming from below felt like summer. The hum started again, so faint it could have been my imagination, but steady, unmistakable, threading its way through the concrete. I took another step down, then another. When I reached the bottom, the scent hit full force, metallic sweetness, mixed with the heavy musk of something that shouldn't fit inside this building. The floor was slightly wet, as if condensation had formed on the tiles from the sudden temperature shift. A soft drip echoed from deeper inside the storage wing. I reached the first door and touched the metal knob. Warm. No. Hot. I pulled my hand back with a sharp inhale. The knob had nearly burned me through the glove. I braced myself, kicked the door open, and stepped back. At first, I thought the room was filled with smoke. But it wasn't smoke. It was steam, dense, curling along the ceiling, drifting out past my face like fog being exhaled from a lung. And then I saw the floor. The snow melt from my boots hadn't caused the wetness. The tiles were sweating heat rising from cracks in the concrete that weren't there yesterday. My pulse hammered in my ears. The humid air clung to my skin, thick and wrong, like the breath of something alive. I stepped forward. The room was empty. No intruder, no animal, no sign of broken entry. But the far wall had a dark streak running from ceiling to floor, as though water had seeped through the concrete. I ran my hand near it, not touching, just close enough to feel. Warm and pulsing, as if something behind the wall had a heartbeat. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of snowshoes. My breath quickened, my skin crawled. The air vibrated with a low, nearly inaudible thrumming that made the overhead lights flicker. And then, softly, there came a sound. Knock, knock, knock. Not outside, not above, behind the wall. I froze, every muscle tightening. My vision blurred, my knees nearly buckled. The knocks repeated, slow, deliberate, like whatever was on the other side was testing the barrier, searching for weakness. Then the wall warmed again. Then the drip echoed again. Then the hum deepened. I backed toward the hall, slow and stiff, like my limbs had turned to wet stone. Every instinct screamed to run, but running felt like an invitation, like it would draw whatever was behind the wall closer. Just as I reached the stairwell, the storage room light flickered violently. The hum surged, the wall made a sound, one impossible for solid concrete, a stretch, a groan, like something behind it was pressing the surface inward. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, nearly slipping on the top step. The metal door slammed behind me, echoing through the empty corridor like the crack of bone. I leaned against the wall, chest heaving. The humming was muffled now, but still there, vibrating faintly through the floor. I had to get out of the station, out of the range district. But that wasn't an option. Storm protocol required at least one ranger on site. And leaving would mean abandoning anyone who might be out there. Lost hikers, snowmobilers, locals stuck on the back roads. I couldn't leave, but I couldn't stay alone. My mind raced, trying to anchor itself in rationality, but rationality had limits, and tonight I'd crossed them. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the tile, head in my hands. The humming grew fainter. The warmth receded, but the fear didn't. Because for the first time I understood something terrifying. The creature in the woods hadn't followed me here. It had always known this place. It had always known me. And now it wasn't watching from the trees. It was beneath my feet. And it was rising. I sat there on the cold tile, staring at the stairwell door, knowing the warmth under the building had not been some anomaly or hallucination. It had moved. It had communicated. It had tested the walls like it was learning what separated my world from its own. And the most terrifying part was the quiet that followed, because that silence wasn't relief. It was patience, and intelligence waiting for the next move. My legs finally responded, though weakly, as I pushed myself up and moved toward the locker room. My mind told me to call another ranger in, someone to share the night watch, someone who could help verify what I felt downstairs. But another voice, deeper, quieter, older, told me bringing anyone else here meant dragging them into something they couldn't fight or outrun. No one else needed to see that thing. No one else needed to feel the ground move like it was breathing. I opened my locker and reached for my emergency gear. Not weapons. I'd handled predators before. I knew what a rifle could do. Whatever lived under this forest wasn't something you scared off with bullets or bright lights. Instead, I pulled out the one tool every ranger keeps not for survival, but for storytelling, my old field journal. The worn leather felt familiar, grounding. Its pages held years of incidents, some real, some nearly unbelievable, all cataloged carefully. My hands trembled as I opened it to the section marked Cave Incident Archived. I'd avoided this part of the journal for years. It was written the night after we found the child's hat outside the cave, the one with the enormous footprints inside. My handwriting had been jagged, frantic, like I'd written with shaking hands. Now, reading it again, I felt that same tremor. The boy had disappeared for 27 hours. When we found him, wandering half-frozen near a drainage basin miles away, he kept repeating the same thing. It was warm. It was warm down there. The rocks were warm. He couldn't explain how he ended up so far from the cave. He couldn't describe who or what he saw. Trauma takes memory and swallows it, reshapes it into something too soft to grip. But one drawing in the journal chilled me now. A child's sketch the boy had made later, something the sheriff had tucked into our files. A tall shape with long arms. No face, just eyes like flat stones. A hum drawn as 3 long lines beneath it. I stared at the sketch, my pulse skipping because the eyes looked exactly like the ones I'd seen in the trees tonight. Exactly. Before I could think further, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from outside, somewhere near the generator shed. I flinched, dropping the journal. My heartbeat surged so violently it hurt. I grabbed my headlamp, snapped it onto my beanie, and moved toward the lobby. The wind howled through the cracks of the old building, but underneath that was another sound, so faint I almost missed it. A dragging, heavy, slow, like something pulling its weight through deep snow. I reached the window and pressed my forehead to the glass, squinting through the storm. At first, I saw nothing. Then the ground shifted. Not the snow, the ground. A swelling bulge like something rising beneath the drifts, moving toward the shed with a patient inevitability. The snow lifted and fell in a slow wave, each rise spaced seconds apart like steps. My breath fogged the glass. Then, through a break in the whiteout, I saw it. A silhouette at the tree line. Motionless. Towering. Watching the building. Even from this distance, its presence pulled something primal from my chest. A fear that didn't belong to modern man. That thing belonged to a world before ours, before language and maps and rules. It was older than our warnings, older than the people who once lived here, older than the stories carved into stone. Its shoulders rose and fell slowly, like it was breathing in the storm. And then, just as my breath slowed enough to steady, it moved one giant hand toward the snow, not to touch it, to press into it. The ground beneath me vibrated, not violently, deliberately, as though it was signaling. I stumbled back from the window, nearly knocking over a chair. The lights flickered. The humming started again beneath the floor, quieter than before, but unmistakable. It vibrated through the soles of my boots, up my spine, into my teeth. It knows where I am. I grabbed my radio, finally, clicked it on and whispered, "Station 4 requesting immediate assistance. Unknown disturbance at the perimeter. Respond." Static, not normal static. A low, buzzing interference, rising and falling in time with the hum under the floor. Then another knock, this time from beneath the foundation. 3 slow, methodical hits. Knock, knock, knock. My throat constricted. I backed toward the center of the room, my body turning cold despite the heat now building from the floorboards. The knocking repeated. The hum deepened. And then, impossibly, the floor grew warm, just like the forest floor had earlier. The heat spread outward like fingers. In that moment, I understood something in a way that stripped all illusion. This creature, or creatures, weren't trapped underground. They lived underground. The caves weren't anomalies. They were passages. The warm ground wasn't a warning. It was a threshold. And the forest wasn't hiding them. It was part of them. The lights flickered violently overhead, buzzing like hornets. The heat intensified. I staggered backward, hitting the wall just as a faint bulge formed in the center of the lobby floor. A subtle rise, no larger than a handprint, but swelling, pushing upward. My eyes locked onto it, breath frozen in my chest. The bulge grew slowly, deliberately. The floor creaked. Dust trembled. A fist? A head? A shoulder? I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted to the breaker box, threw off the main switch, plunging the station into darkness. The humming stopped instantly, cut off like an interrupted breath. But the knocking continued, slower, heavier, like it didn't need the power, like the darkness made it bold. The bulge in the floor rose again, cracking the tile. I stumbled toward the back exit, half sliding across the floor as I fumbled with the panic bar. The storm slammed into me the second the door flew open, wind slicing my coat like blades. Snow whipped in every direction. Behind me, inside the station, something pressed harder against the floor. Something large. The walls groaned. The air swelled with heat. I ran into the storm, headlamp cutting a narrow path through the whiteout, breath tearing at my lungs. My boots punched through drifts as I shouted into the radio again, desperate now. "Station 4, emergency, creature breach. Any unit respond." The radio crackled uselessly. I kept running, not toward the road, not toward safety, toward the tree line, toward the one place I never thought I'd willingly go again, the caves. If this thing had passages beneath the forest, if it was rising now, then I needed to understand it. I needed to know why it hadn't killed me earlier, why it had followed, why it had knocked instead of attacked. Snow pelted my face as a vibration rippled through the ground, stronger than ever, shaking snow from branches. I nearly fell. I steadied myself on a tree trunk just as a sound thundered behind me, a roar without voice, a scream without breath, a deep guttural resonance that vibrated through the storm. It wasn't anger, it was calling something. The forest answered. A distant knock, then another, then a third. I turned toward the darkness beyond the trail, toward the caves invisible in the snowstorm, buried in shadow. And for the first time, I realized the truth that made my blood freeze. There wasn't one creature. There were many, and the warm ground was not a warning. It was a welcome, a door, an invitation. The storm roared, drowning out everything except the pounding of my heart. And with no other choice, no backup, no radio contact, no more rational world left to cling to, I took my first step toward the caves, toward the warmth rising beneath the winter, toward whatever waited below, toward the truth that the forest had been whispering for years, in silence, in heat, in darkness. The ground was warm because something down there was alive, and now it wanted me to follow. I used to think the sky was the only honest thing left out here. But after what I saw that night, after what shifted above the tree line like something rolling over in its sleep, I'm not sure the sky ever told the truth at all. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I was a forest ranger in the northern stretch of the Bitterroot Range for 12 years. I say was because I haven't been back on duty since last winter. Not since the search for Carter Hensley, the kid who vanished on the ridge trail under my watch. I still see his face when I close my eyes. Sometimes I see him when they're open too. I can tell you what guilt smells like after a year of carrying it. It's metallic, like cold pennies on a tongue you can't spit out. People disappear in the wilderness more often than anyone wants to admit. You're told to say, he must have wandered, or it was exposure, or predation is messy and random. But that doesn't explain why we found Carter's backpack neatly zipped under a cedar root system too tight for any child to crawl into, or why the snow around it hadn't melted, even though the ground below was warm enough that steam rose when we dug. I didn't report that part. Some stories you don't hand over unless you want your badge replaced with a psych evaluation. The region they assigned me covers 47 miles of trails, some of which overlap with abandoned mining claims older than the state line itself. There are tunnels carved into the mountain sides that don't appear on any map, some sealed with rusted gates, others left yawning open like throats waiting to swallow the naive or the unlucky. Locals claim the mines whisper when the temperature drops suddenly, and I used to laugh it off. Now I keep a radio playing at night just to make sure the only whispering I hear is the static. The week everything fell apart started with heat. January should have been snow-packed and brittle with cold, but instead warm air pushed across the valleys in shuddering waves. Patches of frost hissed when they melted. Birds didn't return. The forest stayed eerily silent, like everything was waiting for someone else to move first. I was patrolling the boundary near an old fire road that had collapsed years ago. The earth there has a way of shifting without warning, like it's breathing shallowly beneath your boots. I remember wiping sweat from my neck, confused as hell because it was 29 degrees the night before. That's when I heard it. Someone calling my name. Not shouting. Calling. Calmly. Quietly. Like they were standing right beside me. I turned so fast my boots slipped on wet pine needles. No one was there. No footprints except my own, compressing the slurry of half-melted snow. My radio was silent, but the voice, God, I knew that voice. It was Carter. No child's tone, no panic, just a steady, familiar whisper. Ranger, over here. He'd said those exact words the last time I saw him alive. I remember them with painful clarity because I never turned in time. I had been bent over my pack, fixing a strap, thinking he was a few feet behind me with the volunteer group. He wasn't. And now, a year later, his voice drifted from the tree line as if the woods had kept it preserved. I should have walked back to my truck. I should have reported hearing something strange. But guilt is an ugly tether. It pulls you toward the place you least want to go. So I followed the sound. It led me off the fire road and down a slope carved with old runoff channels, the kind that swallow ankles and twist knees. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the air felt warm against my skin. I kept listening, straining, trying to catch direction, but the voice shifted, echoing strangely. Close one moment, far the next, and sometimes it sounded like it came from beneath me. The forest floor softened as I moved deeper. Needles, soil, and decomposing leaves gave under each step like I was walking across a damp sponge. A sour smell rose from the ground, rot mixed with something chemical, like burnt hair and sulfur. I stopped. "Carter?" I whispered, hating how desperate it sounded. Silence. Then a rustling behind me. I spun, hand on my sidearm, but again, nothing. Only a narrow cluster of lodge poles too close together to hide anything larger than a squirrel. Yet I could swear something had breathed behind those trunks. Slow, heavy, wet. I took a step back. The heat vanished all at once. A cold so sudden it punched the air from my lungs spread outward from the ground beneath me. Frost crystallized around the edges of the wet leaves, forming delicate, sharp lines that grew like veins. And then, from directly under my boots, a vibration. Faint at first, then stronger, like something shifting inside the earth. I leapt backward, boots skidding. The soil where I'd been standing sagged inward by an inch, then two. Then it pulsed. a slow, rhythmic throb, as if the land itself had a heartbeat. I've responded to sinkholes, animal dens collapsing, underground water movements. This was none of those. This felt intentional. When I finally forced myself to move, I climbed the slope at an angle, boots slipping, lungs hammering. The forest behind me was quiet again, too quiet, as if whatever had been beneath the soil was holding its breath now. At the top of the ridge, I reached for my radio, but the static that answered was wrong. Not the usual soft hiss, this was layered with something else, a faint clicking, a wet, intermittent popping sound, like joints cracking underwater. Then, between the distortion, my radio whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." It wasn't Carter's voice this time. It wasn't anyone's voice I recognized, but it was human enough to freeze every muscle below my jaw. I tore the radio from my vest, switched channels, checked the signal. Nothing. Dead air. When I lowered it, the forest around me had shifted in color. Not literally, just something about the light felt off. Dimmer, though no clouds crossed the sky. Claustrophobic, though the trees were spaced normally. I'd felt this once before. During Carter's search on the second night, when I swore I saw movement on a distant ridge and hiked toward it. Every step felt wrong, like the woods wanted me to turn back. The air thickened around me, temperature dropping with each yard I covered. I reached the ridge that night to find nothing except a single boot print in the snow. A bare footprint. Small, kid-sized, but deep enough to suggest someone had been standing there for a long time, longer than any child could bear. My supervisor told me I hallucinated it from exhaustion. I never believed that. Now, walking back toward the fire road with my heartbeat still thundering in my ears, I felt the same wrongness peel across my nerves. I scanned the tree line, telling myself I wasn't being followed, but something about the shadows looked elongated, as if something tall had been standing there moments before and had only just stepped away. Back at the truck, I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat breathing through my teeth until my pulse slowed. But the interior smelled strange, like incense burned too fast, leaving a stale sweetness. I checked the vents, the floorboards, even the seams of my uniform. Nothing. The smell faded as quickly as it came, leaving me wondering if it had been there at all. On my drive back to the station, the sky darkened too early for the season. Clouds gathered in tight spirals, almost geometric, and for a few seconds, just a few, I saw the stars rearranging themselves, like someone dragging them across a black canvas from beneath. When I blinked, the pattern settled into something normal. But that moment, that shifting, I still feel it in the base of my spine. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself the forest hadn't whispered my name. I told myself there hadn't been something alive moving under the soil. But I didn't sleep that night. And at 3:12 a.m., a dull thud echoed from the storage bay below my quarters, the sound of something knocking on the concrete floor. Slow. Heavy. 3 times. Then silence. The knock wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like a closed fist striking stone with the certainty that someone would hear it. I lay frozen in the bunk above the station's main garage, listening as the silence stretched thin. The building was old and hollow, every pipe and board familiar to me, and I had never heard anything like that before. 3 knocks. A pause. Nothing else. I tried to convince myself it was old plumbing, the way metal contracts in sudden cold. Or maybe an animal had climbed beneath the structure, but the sound had come from directly beneath the center of the floor, far from any wall, far from any crawl space. After too many seconds of waiting, I got up. I dressed slowly, not wanting to turn on the lights, not wanting to break the fragile tension hanging in the air. The darkness felt aware of me, watching. I moved by memory. Down the narrow stairs, through the hall lined with outdated search and rescue posters, past the break room where the coffee pot sat untouched. At the garage door, I paused. A sour smell leaked from the cracks beneath it, faint but unmistakable. Wet fur. Damp earth. Something else beneath that, like sulfur singed into cloth. I pressed my palm to the cold metal and whispered into the silence, "If someone's in there, you need to answer." Nothing. I lifted the latch and let the heavy door roll upward in jerky increments. The garage sat in darkness except for a sliver of moonlight seeping through a dusty window. My truck was parked like a silent bulk in the center. Tools hung on the walls in neat rows. The concrete floor was undisturbed, but the cold hit me instantly, far colder than the night outside. My breath fogged in front of me, even though the thermometer earlier had read 43 degrees. Something had chilled only this room. I stepped inside. The smell was stronger now, rising from the far corner. I moved toward it, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam jittered across shelves, crates, and storage bins until it landed on something small on the floor. A wet print. Not from a boot. Not from any animal I knew. 5 toes. Human-like. But longer. Too long. The arch curved unnaturally, and the step was deep, as if the weight of whatever made it was far heavier than its size should allow. It pointed toward the drain in the center of the concrete. I swallowed, forcing myself closer. Moisture glistened around the metal grate. Something had seeped up through it, not down. A thin residue coated the edges, thick and cloudy like condensation, but too viscous. I crouched, flashlight angled low. The residue was pulsing, very faint, very slow, but pulsing. I stood so fast I almost slipped. That was when the radio on the wall crackled to life. I flinched, turning toward it as a burst of static filled the room, deep, layered, almost like someone breathing through water. Then a voice emerged, muted, broken, struggling to form shape. "Ranger? Still." My throat tightened. It sounded almost like Carter again, but stretched thin across something unnatural, as if his voice were being forced through a filter not meant for human sound. I took a step backward. The radio hissed, stuttered, and went silent. In the corner of the room, something shifted. Not loudly, but enough. A subtle adjustment of weight, a shift from one foot to another. The kind of sound someone makes when they have been standing perfectly still in the dark for a very long time and just decided to move. My flashlight beam snapped toward the noise, cutting across stacked boxes and metal cabinets. Nothing there, but the smell grew stronger. I backed out of the garage, my breath shaking, and pulled the door down behind me. The sound of the latch sliding into place echoed too loudly in the hallway. For the rest of the night, I sat with my back against the wall, boots on, uniform half-buttoned, listening for another knock. It never came. But the silence felt thick, waiting for something. The next morning, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. Frost clung to the buildings, even though the forecast had predicted a warm front. Tracks, those same long, narrow, human-like prints, appeared in the thin snow near the trailhead. They started at the tree line and ended abruptly 10 feet from the parking lot. No other marks, no approach, no departure. Like something had simply arrived, stood there, and then wasn't there anymore. I photographed the prints, radioed dispatch, and waited for a supervisor to call back. When they did, the response was stiff and canned. Probably melting disturbances or partial animal tracks. Weather's unpredictable right now. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. That phrase, repeated calmly by a voice I had never liked, settled uneasily in my stomach. I checked the prints again. They weren't melting distortions. They weren't animal. I had tracked every creature from moose to mountain lion to barefoot hikers drunk enough to wander trails at night. These prints weren't any of them. But I didn't push it. People who push too hard in this job get reassigned. Or they get files stamped psych review. Or they get told to take time off. I needed none of those. Around dusk, as I made my rounds near the eastern boundary, I reached a portion of forest locals called Breakers Hollow. The place has a reputation, stories about miners who dug too deep, veins of ore that hummed in winter, tunnels that swallowed voices. Most rangers avoid it. The air there feels wrong in an old way. Tonight was worse. There was no wind, but the branches creaked overhead as if something massive had brushed past them seconds before. The smell of iron rose from the ground, warm and sharp. The sky above the ridgeline dimmed unnaturally fast as though a cloud had rolled in, except no cloud appeared on radar or in sight. I stepped further in. The silence deepened around me. Even the insects had gone quiet. The forest felt like it was pulling sound inward, holding it tight. Then something flickered at the edge of my vision, a silhouette, tall, narrow, standing perfectly still between two lodgepole pines that should have been too close together for any body to fit. I froze and looked directly at it. Gone. Not stepped away. Gone. As if it had never been there at all. My breath fogged lightly, even though the air felt warm on my skin again. That temperature shift, the same impossible contradictory swing I had felt near the pulsing ground yesterday, made my chest tighten. I swept my flashlight across the trees. The reflection came first. Two circular glints at waist height, like eyes, but not animal eyes. No tapetum glow, no organic shine. These glints were metallic, perfectly round, perfectly still. I aimed the beam directly at them. Nothing stood there. No creature, no person, just two faint indentations on a trunk, dents in the bark, almost symmetrical, as if something with metal discs for eyes had pressed its face forward and watched me. The dents were warm to the touch. I jerked my hand back. Something rustled behind me, twigs snapping lightly, not in fear, more like an adjustment of posture, a presence making itself known. I did not turn at first. Growing up in Idaho, I had been taught never to swivel immediately toward a predator. You move slowly, deliberately. Show that you are aware without showing fear. But when I finally did turn, the forest behind me was empty. Only the faint print of something dragging lightly across the snow, like fingertips trailing just above the surface. I followed the drag marks with my light. They led back toward the old mining cut, an entrance half collapsed, roped off decades ago. Locals said the tunnel burrowed down farther than any surveyor had ever mapped. Geological records were inconsistent, maps conflicted. Some diagrams suggested chamber systems that reached beneath the valley floor. Most called it a rumor, but the drag marks led straight to the collapsed entrance and stopped. Again, no approach, no departure, just the suggestion that something had paused there long enough to drip warmth into the snow. I felt my heartbeat shift, heavy and irregular. The tunnel was sealed by a rusted grate, its bars bent inward as if something on the far side had once tried to pull them through. A wooden sign hung crookedly above it. No entry. Hazard risk. The letters were faded by time, but someone or something had added a message beneath it in red paint that had not fully dried. Do not call them. My throat tightened. Them. Not it. Them. I stepped closer, scanning the ground. The snow near the grate had melted in an odd pattern, a circular patch as if a warm object had hovered just above the surface, and in the center of the patch something small lay half buried. A coin. No, too thin to be a coin. When I picked it up, the metal was cold enough to bite my skin. A disc perfectly smooth with no markings, no texture, completely uniform except for a faint concave curve on one side. As if it had been pressed against something or someone, a whisper drifted from the grate. Not air, not wind. A voice, faint, distant. It sounded like Carter again. Don't stay. The whisper stretched, warped, dissolving into static. I backed away with slow, measured steps. Then from deep within the tunnel, something shifted. A dragging sound, a long exhale, something moving toward the grate. I did not wait to see it. I turned and walked, forcing myself not to run until the forest swallowed the sound behind me. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I reached the clearing near Breaker's Hollow. My lungs released in a shudder, the cold air cutting sharp down my throat. I kept turning my head, scanning the tree line, half expecting those long, narrow prints to appear beside my own in the snow. They didn't. For a moment, that almost made it worse. Things that want you to see them are dangerous. Things that don't need to be seen are something else entirely. By the time I got back to my truck, dusk had collapsed fully into night. The sky above the ridge still held that strange tightness. Stars packed closer together than they should have been, like the dome of the sky was pulled too taut. I climbed in, shut the door, and sat with the engine off. It was a bad habit I'd picked up since the search for Carter, the need to be absolutely still before making any decision. To let the silence settle and show me whether it felt normal or wrong. Tonight, the silence felt wrong, not because it was quiet, but because the quiet had a hum beneath it, barely audible, a soft, rhythmic vibration running under the chassis of the truck. I pressed my palm against the floorboard. It vibrated, only for a second, just enough for the bones in my hand to feel like they were echoing with something deep underground. I started the engine immediately and drove away from the hollow faster than regulations allowed. I told myself I'd file a report. I'd log unusual seismic activity. I'd say I found signs of trespassers near the old mine. Something clean, rational. But halfway back to the station, I realized my radio, normally bright with static along these mountain roads, was dead silent. Not broken. Just quiet, too quiet, like every signal was being swallowed before it reached me. At mile marker 12, the headlights caught something metallic lodged in the snow at the edge of the road. I slowed, wary. It wasn't a sign, not debris, something small, reflecting light. I left the engine running and stepped out. The cold hit me harder here, a sudden unnatural drop that raised goosebumps along my arms, the kind of cold that doesn't match the environment at all, like stepping into an unlit freezer. The object was half buried, a disc, identical to the one I'd found near the grate, perfectly smooth, no marks, same faint concave indentation. But this one was warm, sitting in a patch of snow that hadn't melted around it. The temperature made no sense, like heat sealed inside the object wasn't allowed to escape. I stood there, breath fogging, holding thing between my fingers, startled by how wrong the texture felt, slippery and dry at the same time, as if the surface rejected moisture. Then my phone buzzed. I nearly dropped the disc. Reception didn't exist here. There wasn't a tower within 15 miles. I checked the screen, no caller ID, just a timestamp, 3:12 a.m., but it was only 7:46 p.m. My chest tightened, I answered. At first, only static, thin, whispering static, like wind running through wires. Then a voice broke through, "You left me." Not a question, a statement, a child's voice, Carter's voice. Except off, too slow, too heavy, like someone replaying his words through a throat that wasn't shaped right for them. "Where are you?" I whispered. The line crackled, a faint scraping sound, metal dragging on stone slid faintly through the speaker. Then, "Behind you." I turned so fast I nearly fell. The tree line behind me was still. My truck idled nearby, breath rising in pale plumes. Snow lay undisturbed, no figure, no movement. But the darkness between the trees, God, it felt full. A pressure grew behind my eyes, like the forest was pushing me backward, like something was leaning close, inches from me, breathing without lungs. The phone clicked. The line died. When I looked down, the call timer read, it had never connected. I tossed the disc into my truck and left the roadside object where it lay. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive back. At the station, the interior lights flickered when I opened the door. Not power grid flicker. This building ran on a stable, overbuilt system designed to withstand winter storms. This flicker was more like interference, something brushing against the electrical lines. I locked the door behind me. The garage was silent. The single damp footprint from the night before had dried into a faint stain on the concrete. At the radio desk, I tried to contact headquarters again. The static wasn't white. It carried that same underwater clicking, that same soft crack pop pattern. No voices reached through. I switched channels, each one worse. At 6 on the dial, Carter's search channel, the static sharpened into something clearer. Not words, but movement, a dragging sound, repetitive, deliberate, like something pulling itself across stone far below ground. At 8, worse, breathing, wet, rasping breathing. I killed the radio. The silence after felt predatory. That night, I had a dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I stood in the woods behind the station, but the trees were wrong. Their trunks were too smooth, like bone polished by hands. Their branches bent in angles that trees shouldn't bend. The stars above were shifting again, slow, fluid, sliding in arcs like constellations stretched on strings. Something moved between the trees. Tall, thin, facing me. It had no face, not that I could see anyway. just a smooth surface where a face should be, pale and slightly concave like the discs. It lifted an arm, too long, joints too soft, and pointed behind me. I turned. Carter stood there, barefoot, pale, eyes dark as if the pupils had swallowed everything else. "Why didn't you stay with me?" he asked. His voice carried the weight of a place I never wanted to imagine. A place without air, without light. I reached for him. He stepped back, face twisting, not in anger, in warning. "They're listening," he whispered. Then the dream broke, like glass cracking, shards of dark pouring inward. I woke gasping, the smell of sulfur thick in the air. My room was freezing, breath hung like smoke. A shadow stood in the corner, tall, narrow, motionless. I blinked. Gone. But the temperature stayed wrong, cold rising from the floorboards, threading up my legs like invisible water. My radio clicked on by itself. A voice whispered through the static, almost gentle, "Come outside." I stayed sitting in the bunk, gripping the blankets with numb fingers. "Come outside," it repeated. Silence pressed against the walls, thick and expectant. I stood, not because I wanted to, because something in that voice, something behind it, left no room for anything else. I walked barefoot down the stairs, each step colder than the last. Frost had formed on the inside of the banister. The station door was unlocked. I didn't remember unlocking it. Outside, the night was too bright. Moonlight lay in perfect white sheets, reflecting off ice crystals forming on the grass. In the center of the clearing, where the search team set up base camp the night Carter vanished, stood a figure. Not a person. Not completely. It was shaped like a person, but stretched taller, limbs thin as branches, head slightly concave. Its surface reflected light in dull, muted waves, like the discs. In its left hand, it held something small, Carter's backpack, unzipped, empty. It raised its right hand and pointed at me, then behind me. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't want to, but I felt it before I saw it, warm breath against the back of my neck. I turned slowly. Carter stood inches away, his eyes were wrong, his mouth too still, his skin cold enough to frost the air. "You left me," he whispered. His breath smelled like earth that had never seen sunlight. I stepped backward, but something cold closed around my wrist. Not Carter. Something else. Something standing behind him. Something I couldn't fully see, only feel. Tall, massive, cold as stone, gripping me with fingers spaced too far apart. I tried to pull away. It didn't move. The forest lights dimmed. The stars overhead rippled like water stirred by something beneath. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was Carter's voice. "They want you to see where I went." I didn't realize how long I'd been standing there until the cold finally crawled through the fabric of my uniform and reached my skin. The forest had gone strangely still again, like it had pulled its breath back into the tree line the moment the last echo of that distant metallic knock faded out. I kept listening anyway, my hands tightening around the straps of my pack, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than an old cabin settling or some abandoned generator frame shifting after the temperature drop. Anything ordinary. Anything human. But the woods didn't answer with anything human. When I finally forced myself to move, the trail ahead felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The pines seemed to lean just a little closer, their silhouettes bending at angles that made me blink twice. The ground felt softer too, each step sinking a little deeper into the soil, as if it was tired of holding its own shape. I kept walking, one slow step at a time, breathing through the chill that kept climbing higher up my spine. I've always believed the forest communicates if you're willing to listen. Most rangers do. We spend enough years out here to recognize when something's off, when the birds go silent before a storm, when the wind carries the scent of rot from someplace it shouldn't, when the land grows restless without giving you a reason. But this wasn't restlessness. This felt closer to watching, observing, waiting. I didn't hear the next sound so much as feel it. A deep vibration, like someone dragging a heavy chain across the ground far ahead of me, somewhere beyond the ridge. It didn't match the crispness of the night. It didn't belong to the forest. My breathing hitched, but I kept walking, tightening my jaw to keep it steady. If I turned back now, I knew I'd never forgive myself. More importantly, I knew I'd never understand what had been edging closer to this part of the woods for the last 2 weeks. The trail bent left, curling through a patch of young aspens so pale they almost glowed under the thin beam of my flashlight. I swept the light past their trunks and froze when the beam caught something dark on the closest one, something smeared in a wide, rough stroke. I stepped closer, and the metallic scent hit me immediately. Blood. Fresh. So fresh it hadn't even begun to brown. But it wasn't the blood alone that made my stomach twist. It was the pattern. 4 long streaks dragged downward, almost parallel, each beginning with a deeper indentation as if someone, had been clawed or pulled against the tree. But the spacing wasn't right for animal claws. Too wide, too uneven, too deliberate. I lifted the light a little higher, and the beam found another mark 3 trees over. Then another, and another. A loose, uneven trail disappearing deeper into the woods. A trail someone wanted me to follow. My grip tightened around the flashlight until the plastic creaked. I didn't want to follow it. Not like this, not with my nerves already tight as wire. But I knew the direction it led, toward the old service cabin nobody had used in almost a decade. A place that had become a rumor, even among the rangers who didn't believe in rumors. I took a step forward anyway. Then another. The air changed with each stride, growing colder and heavier as the forest seemed to press in around me. The silence grew so complete it felt physical, almost like walking underwater. And somewhere in that suffocating quiet I felt it again, that low vibration humming through the ground under my boots. Closer this time, closer than it should have been. I slowed, kneeling to place my fingertips against the soil. The vibration was faint but unmistakable, pulsing through the earth like the heartbeat of something buried just beneath the surface. I swallowed hard and stood again, wiping my hands on my pants even though there was nothing on them. The trail of blood continued ahead, each mark fresher than the last. That was when I noticed the prints. Not footprints, just impressions. Deep oval shapes pressed into the ground on either side of the bloody trail, evenly spaced as if something heavy had walked parallel to whoever had been bleeding. But the spacing was too wide for any person, too wide for any animal I knew. I turned my lights slightly, tracing their path as it curved around a boulder, and then the prints just stopped, not gradually, not fading away, one print and then nothing, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until my lungs burned and forced me to take a sharp inhale. It came out shaky, too shaky. I clenched my fist and took a calming breath, reminding myself that the forest always has explanations, even if those explanations don't show themselves right away. But the truth settled heavy in my chest. Whatever I was tracking out here tonight wasn't something I'd ever tracked before. I adjusted my pack, steadied my flashlight, and stepped over the last print, because the cabin was close now, and whatever waited inside it had been waiting a long time. By the time the outline of the old service cabin finally appeared through the thinning trees, I could feel my pulse thudding in my throat, louder than the wind that had died hours ago. The structure stood exactly where it had always stood on the map, but something about it felt different now. Like the air touching its walls was heavier, older, carrying the weight of things I wasn't meant to disturb. The place had once been a supply station for trail crews, but storms and budgets had left it to rot. I'd only visited it once in daylight years ago, and even then it felt wrong. Now, under a thin sliver of moonlight, it looked like a throat trying to swallow the dark. The trail of blood led directly to the door. I stopped a few feet away, forcing myself to listen. The forest behind me was still dead silent, but the vibration underfoot had stopped. Either whatever was out there had moved somewhere I couldn't sense, or it was already close enough that I didn't need the ground to tell me. I took a slow breath, easing the tension in my shoulders, then reached for the doorknob with a steadying hand. It turned too easily. The door swung open with a low groan that echoed around the interior like an invitation. I lifted my flashlight, its beam slicing through the stale air. Dust hovered in the light like ash. Everything smelled like old wood, mold, and something raw underneath it, something coppery that tightened my jaw the moment I breathed it in. The cabin was almost empty. A single bunk frame lay rusted against one wall. A collapsed shelf leaned sideways in the corner. The floorboards were warped and buckled from years of freeze and thaw. But the center of the room, the center held the thing that stopped me cold. A long, jagged smear of blood stretched across the floor, thick enough in places that it had pooled into the cracks between boards. But it wasn't the volume that hit me. It was the shape. The smear curved in a slow arc, bending toward the opposite wall as if something had been dragged across the floor, and then abruptly lifted. No body. No trail continuing outside. Just a sudden end halfway up the wall where the blood thinned into nothing. I stepped closer, lowering the flashlight to inspect the boards. The wood was splintered, but not from dragging, from pressure. Something had pressed against it hard enough to leave an imprint, a warped indentation shaped like a hand. Except the fingers were too long, curling downward in a way that made my stomach coil. My breath fogged the beam of my flashlight. That was when the temperature dropped again, so sharply that the hairs on my arms rose through the fabric of my sleeves. I turned slowly, listening for anything behind me, anything breathing in the dark. But the silence had thickened into something else now. It felt like being held underwater again, except this time I sensed the weight of something standing in that silence with me, not moving, not breathing, just there. The shadows shifted near the rafters. At first I thought it was a trick of the beam, but then I realized the darkness itself was changing shape, pulling inward, drawing tight as if something was unfolding from the ceiling. My hand tightened around the flashlight until my knuckles burned. Then I saw it. 2 pale impressions, like the reflection of eyes that weren't eyes at all, opened within the shadow. They didn't shine, they didn't glow, they simply appeared, flat, hollow, impossibly wide, and they were fixed on me. The vibration I'd felt in the ground earlier returned now, but this time it wasn't under my feet. It was inside my chest, humming against my ribs like a warning my body couldn't translate into words. I took a single step backward. The eyes shifted, not forward, not down, sideways, as if the thing hanging there was adjusting itself along the wall, flattening, narrowing, bending at angles nothing living could bend. My throat tightened as the shadow peeled away from the ceiling and began lowering toward the floor, silent as snowfall. My legs finally listened. I stepped back into the doorway, never breaking eye contact with the thing unraveling in front of me. The cold thickened with every second, pulling my breath into short, shaking drags. My hand found the radio clipped to my chest, but when I pressed the transmit button, all that came through was static, then a low tone. A deep, pulsing hum that matched the vibration inside me, beat for beat. The shadow reached the floor. It didn't stand. It didn't crawl. It simply stretched, expanding its shape across the wooden boards like spilled ink searching for the edges of the room. Those pale impressions never blinked, never shifted away from me. The hum from the radio grew louder, matching the thing's movement as though the cabin itself was resonating with whatever had been waiting inside it. I stepped backward again, out into the cold air. The moment my boots hit the dirt, the hum stopped. Every sound, every vibration, gone. The shadow froze at the edge of the doorway, its shape flattening again as if the threshold itself held it back. My breath caught as I waited, watching for any sign it would cross into the open. But it didn't. It stayed pressed against the dark interior of the cabin, those pale impressions locked on me. I took one more step back, then another. The thing didn't follow. It only watched. And as I turned, forcing myself into a steady walk down the trail, I felt the forest shift around me. Not in fear, not in warning, but in acknowledgement, as if something old had finally revealed itself. And as I made my way through the cold silence, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever lived in that cabin didn't come from the forest. It came to the forest, and it was waiting for me to return.